This episode is brought to you by Spira Capital. Founded by 2008 Ron Brown scholar Ethan Monreal Jackson, Spira Capital is your fractional C-suite. Whether you're a startup or a venture firm, a freelancer, or a family office, Spira Capital gives you the scale, support, and stability to grow. Stop worrying about stuff like bookkeeping, accounting, FP&A, operations, HR, payroll and benefits, or your international workforce. Let Spira Capital run those for you so you can run your business. To learn more, visit spiracapital.co. That's C-O. Welcome to The Value of One, The Power of All, a podcast created by the Ron Brown Scholar Program. Since 1996, this organization has been investing in the next generation of African American leaders. And this podcast highlights the stories of the people that make this program special. I'm your host, Ray Pryor, 2015 Ron Brown Scholar. And in this season, presented by the Ron Brown Venture Lab, we're highlighting founders in our alumni network who are changing the world through innovation and entrepreneurship. We'll dive into their personal upbringings and backgrounds, the origins of their ideas, and the successes and challenges they've had along the way. Today, I'm excited to share my conversation with Dr. Jay Cunningham, a 2016 Ron Brown captain, assistant professor of computer science at DePaul University, and the co-founder of AmendLabs. Thank you for hopping on here and been looking forward to having you on the podcast for a while. And also, as of recently, welcome to Chicago as well. Glad to have another Ron Brown guy here in the city. And can you just start, for the audience that doesn't know much about you yet, just a high-level overview of where you're from, what Ron Brown year you were, where you went to school? And you've got a lot. You've got a lot of things you've accomplished. So as much as you want to cover at the beginning, just kind of give us a little bit of a background on yourself.
Yeah. No, I definitely can do that, and I'm really excited just to be here. Being here in this space, I've been trying to find ways to engage more with the Ron Brown community as well. But yeah, man. So I guess just to jump in, my name is Dr. Jay Cunningham. I'm a 2016 Ron Brown captain. I'm originally from a small town called Artesia, Mississippi. Really close to like Memphis and Birmingham. And I'm an educator, a researcher, and I'm a founder. And much of my work is at the intersection of like technology, justice, and community. Most recently, I finished my PhD in human-centered design and engineering at the University of Washington. I focused a lot on my dissertation and my graduate research on equity and AI, human-centered design, and specifically around like designing like culturally a contextual AI system. So how do we design systems that are like just, systems that are not harm inflicting, and systems that actually try to more align with human expectations. Yeah, my background is in computer science. When I was in undergrad, I studied computer science at the University of Alabama, Roll Tide, and started in my kind of like tech journey and career there. I was really involved as an undergraduate student in engineering, but also just in social spaces. And I really enjoyed asking questions at the intersection of society and also technology. And so then after undergrad, I decided to go and study and pursue my graduate studies. So I did my master's and my PhD at University of Washington. And now I just moved to Chicago after being in Seattle for almost 6 years. And I'm joining DePaul University as an assistant professor of computer science, working on more responsible AI systems and society research. So it's been a journey the last almost 10 years now. I thought about this like since being in and around the Ron Brown community.
Right. Yeah. Well, so thank you for sharing that overview. I'll just share with you a little bit. I had a guy I went to school with. We actually spent some time in Mississippi together while we were in college, actually. And he was the first person to introduce to me what AI and machine learning was. And he was way advanced for his age, had already published articles, really smart guy. But as I'm thinking through that evolution of that same decade span that you're talking about, from us graduating high school and then now, so much has happened even at the very beginning of our college careers that AI is a very different conversation than when we were both coming out of school and even you studying computer science. Obviously, what has become large language models and AI and machine learning and all these things is an evolution over time. But things certainly have kicked up over the last few years. And so I'm wondering for you, you've obviously been studying this way longer than just people have been reading about the headlines and thinking about it. Where was your first exposure to what AI meant? And it sounds like you didn't just have the lens enough to understand the technology, you also had the lens enough to understand the implications. seemingly well before anybody else was
Yeah.
thinking about it, at least in the general public sense. Obviously, you and your colleagues have been. But how did you discover AI and get interested?
Yeah, no, that's a really, really good question. I feel like it's one of those things where, like, automated systems is nothing new to a lot of us. I grew up like a computer nerd, man, so I love computers, I love technology, and I think that like as we continue, systems change over time. So when we were like, young kids, we've seen the like emergence of like, of like pagers to the flip phones. The first like smartphone when Apple really dropped like the iPhone and systems and devices that were basically automating what you're doing. And one thing that I love, like in my teachings, I always ask my students, like, what is technology, right? And it's funny because you get all these really funny answers on like, oh, it's like something you plug in, it's a computer, it's a machine. And I love bringing to class like a hammer, right? And I'm like, oh, is this hammer like a technology, right? The students are like, I guess maybe you do something with it. I'm like, cool, it's a tool, right? And then I have maybe like a drill, right? And I'm like, all right, this is technology, yeah. I'm like, what's the difference between like a hammer and then like a drill or a screwdriver and a drill? And I think someone ends up like this light bulb comes on and just like, oh yeah, a drill like makes it faster, it makes it work more efficiently. I'm like, it's automated, right? Like, yeah, like you took from having to like actually do some manual work or screwing to drilling something and it supercharges that process for you. And the way that I love breaking it down to that simple terms is just like how we think about AI and technology as a whole is just like these are tools that extend our human capacity and ability to just do things that we would already been doing before. So whether it is like, twisting in a nail or a screw, whether it is typing or word processing, whether it is like analyzing data, large amounts of information. So being in the library, flipping through books, you now can use your GPTs to automatically search online libraries. And so I think that this emergence though of like AI as we're thinking about it, it's kind of like at this what we call this fourth like industrial revolution, right? And so it's like now if we think, if we trace back foundations of AI, like we look into like early work, and this is me getting really geeky here, it's like neural networks from like the 40s and 50s. But the real connections and acceleration began in like the 2010s with the deep learning breakthroughs, the introduction of like transformer architecture. And there was a really there was an amazing paper called like the attention is all you need, which was a watershed moment that gave us a lot of ways to process language that was more efficient and effective than we'd ever seen before. And then what followed that was like these series of like larger like models, like GPT-1, GPT-2, which was initially considered too dangerously to release fully, and now we got GPT-3, which some researchers didn't even fully like anticipate. So much of this technology is built on like statistical learning and pattern recognition. But large language models themselves, they're from AI systems, have developed a huge leap. And so around like, again, like 2017, 2018, when OpenAI's GPT and Google's BERT came out, we saw a huge shift that of models and technology that not only could like automate information, but generate human-like language. And that hadn't been done before, right? Like we used to have like things like autocorrect and when you're typing, you get spell check, things to guide you. But now that you can do human like data, human like text production, summarizing documents, writing code, even passing professional exams. And that power that many of these systems come with is just scale. They're trained on massive amounts of internet data, which means they absorb both knowledge and bias. And what we're seeing today is like this inflection point where like AI is no longer in a lab, but it's like in our classroom, it's in our courtrooms, it's in our communities, which means that stakes are much, much higher. So yeah, like I feel like many of us now when we hear AI systems, it gets really buzzy because people are just like, is it taking over? Is someone taking our jobs? But like I think the way that I'm looking at it now, this is just the next wave of developing tools in your toolkits. Many of our workflows are going to automate through AI systems now. But could you imagine someone applying for a job now and not knowing how to use Microsoft Office? Because back in the day, you used to put Office on your resume, like I'm proficient in Office, and now it's
Right.
like,
Yeah.
duh, why shouldn't you? So I think that now that society is kind of moving towards like, will you be more proficient in AI-based systems and tools to make you more efficient and more productive in your work?
Yeah. Yeah. That's well said. I appreciate your framing and a little bit of the history around some of the large language models and then even the simple analogy that I think crystallizes it: the screwdriver, the hammer versus a drill, and defining what technology means. I think you're certainly right that it is a natural evolution, looks very similar, has similar impacts and concerns and anxieties and excitement as other industrial revolutions. But you touched on something that I realize is very different about AI. Technology advancements, they might have been military projects that the government was funding as we're using on before it was released to the public, or, it was kept in labs, like you said, and in small spaces. But AI is very different to where obviously it's been worked on for a while, but now it's released generally to the public, and so we all have it, students have it, but now the government is having to catch up, and corporations are having to catch up, and it's a reverse from compared to how technology is diffused in the past. And so I would imagine that that means there's a lot more concerns or a lot more ramifications that we're having to deal with that's different. When you think about AI, certainly all the things that it will help us do is exciting, but you've also spent a lot of time researching the importance of trust, the importance of safety, the importance of understanding bias. I think a lot of people will hear those terms as it relates to AI. Can you help us really understand what harm could AI do from that lens that you research? And what are the biggest things that you're worried about as you see the models get better and better at even faster rates than they even have over the last decade or so?
Yeah. No, I appreciate this. I mean, I think like what really excites me about like AI systems is like there's this increasing potential to like democratize access to capabilities and just to supercharge what you've been doing, right? So I've seen, AI systems help students write essays better or like help small businesses create professional marketing tools. Even me as a researcher assisting in making sense of like vast amounts of like data. So there's something really profound about technology that can serve as a force multiplier for just human creativity and problem solving. I'm particularly excited about AI's potential in like education and mentorship. Like I'm working on a project where I'm even trying to develop personalized tutoring and learning systems that adapt to students' learning styles, or AI coaches that help people develop new skills in their own pace. And then for communities that have been historically underserved by like educational institutions, for example, AI could provide like really great access to high quality learning experiences regardless of like geography or economic circumstance. But the excitement is like really tempered by very real concerns about how AI is being produced and developed so rapidly. Since 2022, we've seen emergence of like AI systems and tools. Like at some point, people can't understand what's the difference between like GPT, Gemini, Claude. We have so many tools that are doing somewhat of the same like capabilities that I think right now what we're experiencing is this almost forced sense of technological innovation. And that it comes to say like, are people even asking for these things? And I think what we're really getting to see is like there's this inflection point where we see that like unfortunately like capital and capitalistic interest is driving so much of the AI production, which means that like the culture of technology typically is like again, how do we extend human capability? How do we build something people need? How do we develop tools and services to help you work, easier, faster, better? But now, like those questions from developers are like, how do I build something to sell? How do I build something people will get hooked to? How do I build something that like I can make money off of? Like, what's going to be the next buzzy thing? And I think that like this concentration of AI capabilities, mostly in the hands of a few large corporations, raises questions about whose values and priorities are often like embedded in these systems. And so when a small number of companies control these models that millions of people interact with on a daily basis, we risk creating like new forms of technological colonialism. And so much about the culture of technology now, it's about decolonizing technology innovation. And so like there's really, really deep concerns on the ways that AI can reproduce structural inequalities through things like biased training data sets, surveillance tools, and even extractive data practices. I think my biggest fear is that we'll automate injustice under the gauze of innovation, right? My biggest hope is that we can find different paths of innovating where AI reflects like the dignity and needs and values of communities. Because like there's been instances already of like 8 month pregnant woman in Detroit and facial recognition misidentifying her, and then she's detained for suspicion of like committing a robbery. Right? There's this study by like Joy Bloom Weenie that show Black women are the most unrecognized people in facial recognition systems. The federal government is using AI for prison sentencing and recidivism programs, which, when it takes historical sentencing data, it overly harms and exacerbates inequalities for like Black and brown men in the justice system. So, like, it doesn't mean just because we introduce AI tools that they're going to work better, faster, without bias. they're only going to like exacerbate those social.
Yeah, that's powerful. What you said made me think about a few different founders, many of whom in the venture lab who are building around AI and or have both share both the excitements and concerns that you do. One of them in particular is building in an emerging market, a very new space that she said, we're not really necessarily asking for AI. We need to make the transition to spreadsheets and PDF before we even talk about super robust software and artificial intelligence. And it just made me have a lens of thinking about how it's more of technology in search of problems now rather than us searching for the solutions and landing on AI as something that can be great.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly we're going to maximize it and take advantage of it. But I can see how, no differently than a hammer or a drill, it can build a lot of things, both good and bad, depending on who's building it. You've had the opportunity to work at nearly all of the big tech companies, certainly many of them who are big players here, Google, Apple, Meta. You've seen it all. You've seen it inside. You've also seen it as a researcher. I imagine that if you ask people who work at those companies, even some of them who are working on these models, they would say they agree with you. They would say that they care a lot about it.
Mm-hmm.
Where is the disconnect between what's happening at these big AI companies and it seems like these impacts are still happening, or it's still not landing as I assume I hope they would intend, but certainly as you're warning us about.
Yeah, that is very, very interesting because, like, I find like when I connect with people who are just like engineers, technologists, like people are people, right? Like, and even while like I got into this space was because during my jobs as a software engineer, as a product manager, we were often told to build stuff, and then even when you had ideas around whether you should build something, how you should build it, or who gets impacted by it, those were never the questions, not the questions that we could answer or ask. But most times it wasn't necessarily your place to. And I think a lot of these things really stems down to organizational constraints, stems down to interests of stakeholders for companies and corporations. If you're a small like startup or you're trying to just bootstrap a new venture, oftentimes like you thinking about producing something first. We all talk about an MVP, right? And then you think about the impacts. You spend something out, and then you think about the impacts of stuff later. Because you want to get investment, you want to get people to see what you build, you want to get that attention, you want to get traction. And I think that last year I actually did this study where I had a chance to study some NLP engineers, and a part of the study was like understanding that like only about 20% of engineers in this study even reported that their jobs or their careers made them think about like data ethics or equity whatsoever. A lot of it had to do about quality, but quality wasn't also correlated with like range or diversity of data either. So how could something be high quality but not be representative, but not actually be like diverse in what they're doing? Like when we say quality for AI systems, we mean the robustness of the system integrity. How well does the actual system perform? But this also can take into account things like experience of the user, experience of society, experience of the environment. So who could be harmed by this? Who does it benefit? Interrogating social conditions, data histories, and even power dynamics embedded in tools is many of the things that I argue for in my work. Most technologists are like our just techno laborers. Like we sit behind our really nice glass buildings and our really, really cool benefits at your tech companies. And sometimes it's gaze, but you're on the assembly line building tech for people. And many times like, it's not your place. You don't get a lot of power even in that. You assume because organizations many times have not set a precedent for it. It's what's really frustrating right now is in like this current political climate, we're seeing such rollback of like protections, equity initiatives, not only just like socially, but like also technically. The US like lacks behind even in like AI regulations, policy work, and even governance, right? The EU AI Act has been like an amazing blueprint for actually having like government like regulations around AI. But the thing about the US is if we do that, that starts to stifle, market trade, right? Like, or it stifles how many companies can get in on the market, or even just like the idea that putting regulations on data, which is something that I'm super, super passionate about, or creating systems that help you manage data is so necessary because like who could have imagined that like, data was the most slept on thing of the last, 2 decades. No one thought that internet data would be as pivotal as it is. From Mississippi in the 1800s, we used to say cotton is king, but like 2025, data is king. And mostly he, who can wield the power to collect data, to take that information, and to build things off of it for free. Again, we're talking about laboring of this now, right? Most times, data systems that feel AI, people aren't paid for them. A lot, like many of these large corporations are not considering these ethical implications because it often assumes responsibility, and it also assumes that someone needs to be paying for or something, right? So like it's like let's not talk about it. But I think what it does, the final thing I say is it disarms the individual technologists to feel like they don't have power even in their place to act. So people are people. People recognize the problems, but when we live inside these social contexts and we work for organizations, if those priorities are not aligned, then like you ultimately only build what they want you to build.
Yeah, powerful framing. A lot of what you just shared is the thesis around you wanting to build your own company in this space and to do things very differently than they've been done previously and by your peers. Can you just share a little bit about Amend and what y'all are building towards and what you're doing and more importantly, why? What hole do you see in the market of a lot of new AI companies and a lot of new startups? Yours is very different and has a different mission as well as framework and approach and perspective that I think is very compelling.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. So yeah, I've been working on a new venture called AmendLabs, which is a public benefit corporation. I co-founded to like help people really reclaim their power over their data. And so what we're really trying to do is be on this mission to reimagine the data economy so that people, especially those historically exploited by technology or underserved by technology innovations, have ownership, consent, and even financial stake in how AI gets built, and that's one part infrastructure and one part movement. And what my co-founder Johan and I have really been engaging with is that, like, there's this realization that most discussions around AI ethics and safety happens in academic conferences, corporate boardrooms, far removed from the public, and sometimes people that are most affected by technologies. And we found that Amen Labs really bridge this gap. We're trying to create some technology innovation, but also be very, very like socially responsible in doing that. I think that, many times when we think about starting new tech ventures, it's the move fast, break things model. But like we have to question, like, who or what are the things and people that get broken in that process. So this work is focusing on like three kind of core areas. First, we're developing tools and frameworks that help organizations that produce AI technologies assess and improve the trustworthiness of the AI systems. And so we're trying to create an actual like data ethics certification program for AI enterprises. Secondly, we're providing like some tools that help people actually be able to monetize their data. And so most people, especially like creators, artists, everyday users, can contribute their personal data like photos, audio, activity logs to an ethical data trust, and receive residual payments when that data is licensed to AI enterprises. So it's really this reverse model of data laboring where typically, these companies go and they web scrape data from online. They collect massive amounts of data from these sources. And maybe you have public social media pages, or maybe you are a streamer and you post on YouTube and your data gets used because like it's publicly available. It gets scraped. It trains systems. But what happens is that, again, he who has data is able to build whatever. So it's like, oh wow, we realize that these corporations are able to build these technologies at scale mostly because they get free data. And I think now we're entering this era where people are much want to be much more like aware about their digital bodies, um, and to be able to have say in what information you take from them. And so, and because of this need for enterprises to get more accurate human source data, there's this critical gap, and enterprises getting information that they need, the public being able to give information that they want to give while also consenting to it and being fairly compensated by it. That model doesn't really exist. There's some nonprofit organizations that are doing this in specific communities. There's no widespread adoption of a platform that allows you to really go and like almost license your data and like lease that data to AI enterprises, right? And so, Amen Labs is in the research, but also the business of producing ethical data services to enterprises and providing like consent-driven frameworks for the public.
You know, that's powerful. But by putting everyday people in a position to have the power over what data they want to share, and by doing that, what things can be built. And normally, I assume we'll all opt into things that we want to see. It's kind of a way of taking power back, of kicking a bit more agency over what direction AI heads into, and giving people more voice and say.
Yeah.
So I think that's really great. So there are a few things that you talked about here. You talked a little bit about data, you know, quality, and then you also added the lens of kind of equity, if you will, over that. Not just great data, but also how comprehensive and inclusive is this data. And then you also talked about the incentives of people who are at these companies who are helping build these models, who certainly are passionate about technology and want to do the right things and help the world, but sometimes things can be misaligned or people don't have a voice. There are a handful of Ron Brown folks who are building some exciting startups using AI who are trying to find new ways to apply this technology. And it seems that they, in a position of a founder, in a few years, in 5 years, in 10 years, there's no reason to think that one of us or many of us won't be in that position of power at one of these companies or one of these institutions. What advice would you give for them early in their career, early in their journey, building with AI, whether it's at work or whether it's for their startup? What do they need to be thinking about as they continue to wanting to take advantage of this new age of technology and all that it can do, but we know that they care about the same things that you care about. What advice would you give to them about how to be mindful of the things that you're talking about, as well as to still push forward and to innovate as they've been doing?
Yeah, yeah, I love this a lot because I think one of the things that I've come to realize, I went to university, I got a PhD, but like not everyone needs to, and also I think that most of our technologists, are people who maybe to undergrad and they want to start a company. There are people that found a really amazing idea and want to push forward to it, and not everyone has a critical social and political background. The inherently thinking about the harms of AI systems is a social thing. It's not always a technical framing, right? Like there's only so much like statistical data that you can run. There's only so much fine tuning that you can do to basically try to account for biases or account for things that could be harmful. But many times this is taking something that I call a techno-realist design approach. This is a framework actually that I developed out of my PhD work. And in human-centered design and HCI research, we talk a lot about like having framings, right? And so this techno-realistic approach means that like while we care about developing technology. Typically, we're techno optimistic, which means that we're overly gazed at like what technology can do for us. We think more about like what the outcomes are going to be, what the impact is going to be, and we can also be like what Meredith Bouchard calls techno chauvinistic. Is when we actually then like start to assume that technology is going to solve problems for us, not just the vehicle to do that. When we're realistic about it, it's a critical mindset of like approaching development that embraces like both transformative power of AI but also its embedded risks. So which means that we can't always be like we're like unrealistic or just like really overly promising about what AI systems can and should do. And I think doing this though, and insisting that technology innovation should be grounded in a few things: historical awareness, system critiques, even in community accountability. I want founders to think a whole lot about just a couple of questions: who benefits from what you build? Who may be burdened by what you build? How might what you build have explicit impacts or implicit impacts, right? When you're developing a new product, they do like a lean product canvas, right? And it's like, what problem are you solving? But also, we need like this canvas to be like, what are the harms and policies? What are the pitfalls of systems? Like, what is your system supposed to do? If your system is used in an adverse way, if it did the complete opposite of what you built, if we built a public safety AI system to try to understand and track people that commit crimes, right? And using facial recognition technology for public safety, while the intent is to use that to track individuals that have like committed crimes, how could it also be used to maybe like really police communities that have already been systemically burdened? How could it be used to either harass or put people like in danger, right? Having these questions of adverse impacts as well. Well, having these perceptions of adverse impacts alongside trying to answer the questions about what's innovative are going to work wonders for founders, because this means that when you also are going to pitch your products, your companies, I am like always the critic. And even though I sit on this small venture board, I'm always the person asking questions around. Say you're going to build a synthetic voice model. Yeah, sure. But like, who's annotating your data, right? Like, where are you getting this information from? Like, if you're not already producing a product or service, you have to be siphoning your data from a different source. Can you actually copyright an open source data set. No, you can't do that. You can't use that for enterprise AI software. So it gets into the nitty gritty of things because again, people get very, very gazed about what systems might do. And so I think that for Ron Brown scholars and captains who build systems, starting with thinking about like, what's sometimes the worst outcomes, how do you want people not to use something? What could happen? And just designing also, and not just designing for those scenarios, but being aware of what those things could be, right? That helps you mitigate harms before they actually even start. That helps you create like contingency plans for your systems because when it's not if they fail, it's a matter of when they fail because it's hard to design for every context and scenario. Having diverse perspectives in your design process will be incredibly valuable. And we have a really amazing network, right? So leverage the expertise. You got me in the network. I'm on the one of the scholar mentor boards this year. You have other scholars who have become founders. So now it's been putting your brains together. Even when you don't have all the information, there's somebody out there that has that context too.
Yeah, that's well said. I think Ron Brown folks are uniquely positioned by who they are, how they grew up, what they care about. I think if we had to choose people who we want to be building it, it's certainly them. But I think it's really that you shouldn't be building it in the silo by yourself and thinking you have all the answers. You do
Uh-huh.
have access to people that you can think through these important ramifications for. I want to come back to you a little bit personally about how you think about all of the expertise that you have as a software engineer and now as a researcher. You could have easily worked at one of these AI companies. Word on the street is that some of them may have asked you to and may want you to in the future, right? But you've decided to teach. You've decided to train the next generation, not just through the courses that you'll teach at DePaul, but also through this lab that you're leading. Why does that matter so much for you to
Yeah.
not just take what you know and obviously you're a founder, so you're going to build with it,
Yeah.
but you've also made a concerted decision to spend a significant amount of your time investing in the next generation of people who are going to build on these models so that they not only have the technical skills but also the values and the framework to think through the social ramifications, just how they would learn the lean startup model and how they would learn to move fast and break things if they took a business or entrepreneurship class. Why go back and teach if you could just run off and be a billionaire yourself with everything that you know?
Yeah, no, man, it's a, I'm always reflecting on this question. I'm starting to lean into more of my purpose nowadays. And it's funny because when I first got into computing in general, it was like, oh, I like computers, like technology, I can make some money, right? But then I think like once you get to this point of like, okay, making money is cool, but then what's a purpose behind this? And I remember when I decided to go get a PhD, many of my friends were like already working in tech as software engineers. And someone's like, man, you spend 5, 6 years in a PhD program, that's like $1 million in comp that you might miss out on, right? And I'm like, yeah, but like I get more closely aligned with what I care about. And now it's funny because, fast forward, I'm done with my graduate studies. And now some of my same peers are like, oh man, I've been working this job, made a lot of money. I hate what I do, right? It doesn't matter. Like, or we're doing things that I think are harmful. I think for me, I grew up again in the deep South. I grew up in rural Mississippi. I went to college in Alabama, and I grew up really on the backs of like amazingly civil rights leaders. And my family was also deeply engaged in social political action, having again just deep histories of civil rights movements in the deep South, and also being interested in computers and technology. I kept seeing how we create a lot of movement around social inequalities, and especially in America, right? But then social inequities can also be perpetuated technically. I think what I started to see when I was in undergrad was like misalignment between things I would be learning in the classroom as a student, how to build, how to design, questions that ask things to ask questions about, versus what you actually see out socially, right? Seeing how the AI and algorithmic systems fail to reflect or respect the way people are planning to get served, especially Black communities. And what struck me the most was how invisible the harms were. My PhD work surrounded developing methods to designing AI systems, developing research methods, and even frameworks that make those harms and systems visible and also accountable. And so, even my graduate dissertation work was on understanding the social and technical impacts of speech recognition systems on African American English speakers. I had a chance to work at a bunch of companies like Google, Apple, Microsoft, all on like fairness and machine learning frameworks. But I think that for me now, I've been teaching for the past like 3 years, and I get a really good kick out of like being able to be around like students, because I think students always bring this new fresh perspective of like ideas and this certain like if you took every Ron Brown scholar captain when they got into the program, right, and gave them ideas, think about what they would build. Think about the problem they will solve, right? We think about those 17 to 18-year-olds that wrote those essays and how just like
Right.
fired up they were about doing stuff. Imagine having a class of like 20, 30, 50 of those type of students, right? And I think for me, realizing that most times when we enter the workforce, we do get reinforcement training, but it's very, very based on the organization that you work for, which means that one organization has like really, really amazing like pedagogy or training on AI ethics, and another one doesn't. Like that means the person that doesn't just won't have a chance to get that type of context. And I think what I have enjoyed doing, I'm realizing that something that we're calling critical computing education or critical computing pedagogy, which is a track in computer science, and not only teaches us how to develop things, how to code, but also what are the pitfalls of systems, how can systems be harmful, how to develop technology from a critique perspective, is a really amazing skill that I think all emerging and existing technologists should have. Now I'm starting at DePaul University. I'm launching the RAISE Lab, so responsible AI systems and societal experiences, where I am continuing to pursue questions to advance equity centered AI through things like community based and community informed research, even having things like global collaboration, because most of our technologies are built in a Western context. So when you apply them in Africa and Latin America and indigenous communities, they're so misaligned with what people actually want and need, right? So there's so many different factors that play into how we learn and understand, and where we position ourselves in society. But I think for me, I really enjoy being, a researcher, being an educator, an innovator, and even a leader in this space. And one of the things that I've been the last 2 years now, I've really been getting a lot into AI policy and regulation. In Washington State, I support the AI task force from the Attorney General's office. And so actually actively engaging with like state officials, state legislatures, doing research on AI and even helping to write legislation on AI, because like regulation is like the lasting impact that we can have. So if we can learn from research, if we can develop more responsibly, make communities more aware, and regulate more effectively, we build AI for the common good.
Yeah, that's well said, man. I'm glad you're in the driver's seat, not just in your work on the ground as a founder and as an advocate in areas, but also in helping raise up the next group of folks who are going to take the mantle after they finish school. I had a few more things I wanted to ask you about. One that
Yeah.
you just mentioned, you were on track with your peers working as a software engineer. You chose to go down the path of a PhD. They kept going, and you ended up finding that they may have you might have been onto something that they just didn't understand yet about decisions. I think there's a lot of Ron Brown folks who are in that spot where you were before, where you certainly could have kept going down the path of wherever this being a part of these companies is going to lead you. But you
Uh-huh.
chose to go down a PhD. Tell us a little bit about that decision. What made you pause kind of the track that you're already on, that you were already very successful with, to head down this PhD route?
Yeah. Knowing what I know now, I studied computer science and electrical engineering. But then I realized that, even in computing, so many different pathways. You can be a software developer, but then that means you can be a full stack engineer. You can be a systems engineer, machine learning engineer. Like there's program managers, there's analysts, there's data scientists, there's UX designers and developers and researchers. But I think many times, again, like when you're like young and impressionable, you don't really realize those things. Or when you come into college, students aren't always presented with all those array of options. Knowing what I know now, I wanted to do user experience research and design. But my university only had like computer science systems education, which was like actually building and integrating systems. And I think that there was a defining when I decided to go to pursue graduate studies. I think I was really intentional on not doing a PhD in computer science because I knew how to code, I knew how to build things, but I really wanted to ask questions around who, what, where, and why do we build things. There's a subfield of computer science called human-computer interaction, where we study interactions of people, society, and computing. So this can be like interaction techniques, haptics. Back in the day, we used to call it human factors, especially in more like traditional engineering practices. But human-centered design can be visual, it can be creative, it can be frameworks, and even just design of thought, design thinking as a whole area that you can go down a rabbit hole in. But I think what I really, really cared about was doing something that allowed me to sit at the intersection of equity, technology, and society. At University of Washington, we have a large computing community there. So I have friends that did computer science. I have friends that got a PhD in information science. And my PhD happened to be in human-centered design, right? But that means I think most of the way I pursue questions in my research are not always for advancing development of a system in particular, but it could be advancing the experiences of a user. It could be advancing the ways in which people see it, studying how people perceive it, understanding whether people want it, how should we design it for certain groups of people other than others. And so I think like knowing that like human-centered computing is this idea of like you don't just build stuff to build it, but you build it in particular context, right? I think that many of us, like especially being in our capitalist society, we assume that when we build technology, everybody should have it, everybody should use it. Like I want this to grow and scale like Google. And it's just not realistic, not now at least. But also it's because the best solutions perform in very hyper local and very specific use cases. If you're building systems and technologies that are for language recognition, it's hard to say that we're building a transcription app that's going to recognize every language in the world. Where do you go? Where do you get that information from? Should there be just regional applications? Even in Africa, there's an organization called Ghana NLP. In the University of Ghana, they're doing a standardized like language data set collection project to develop like LLMs in native Ghanaian languages. And that's what I mean when I say hyper local. It isn't the place of Google or Apple or some huge tech company to always build a solution. And so I think I enjoy studying how do we design computing solutions around people that need them the most. And yeah, I think it was really interesting when you decide not to like stay on like the tech rat race because it feels really good. The money is good. The benefits is good. I'm not telling anybody to like jump your tech job and go do something else. Milk it while you can. But human-centered design is I think, a really, really cool subfield just because, again, you don't just learn how to build, but you learn who to build for, what to build, and should you even build stuff.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Value of One, The Power of All, a podcast created by the Ron Brown Scholar Program, presented by the Ron Brown Venture Lab, and sponsored by Spira Capital. If you want to hear more inspiring conversations like this one, don't forget to click subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. And to learn more about the organization, check us out at ronbrown.org.